A powerful CEO goes undercover as a janitor, but what he discovers behind closed doors will leave him speechless. Corruption, betrayal, and a shocking truth. Will he save his company before it's too late? Edward Crawford sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, the glow of the projector illuminating the cold steel in his blue eyes. The quarterly earnings report was on the screen, numbers neatly arranged in a way that showed growth, stability, and success. Everything seemed perfect, on paper. But something felt off. He noticed the way his employees shifted in their seats. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others kept their heads down, pretending to take notes. Douglas Flint, his trusted chief operating officer, stood beside the screen, flipping through slides with a smooth, rehearsed confidence. But Edward caught the slight tremor in his hand. "Any questions?" Douglas asked, scanning the room. Silence. Edward knew this silence well. It wasn't the silence of satisfaction, it was the silence of fear. He leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked. "I want to hear from you," he said. "How's morale? Any concerns?" More silence. Then, finally, one brave voice from the back spoke up. "Sir," the man hesitated, "there have been complaints. Some employees feel they're being overworked. Others, well, they say they haven't received their bonuses. They were promised, but—" A sharp look from Douglas cut him off. The room tensed. Edward's stomach tightened. "We appreciate all feedback," Douglas interjected smoothly. "Of course, we are always looking to improve." Edward's jaw clenched. He had built Crawford Industries from the ground up. He knew every detail, every balance sheet, every projection. He had always believed his company was fair, ethical, and efficient. But tonight, as he watched his employees avoid his gaze, as he saw the unspoken frustration in their faces, he realized, he was blind. He didn't know what was really happening in his own company. That night, he barely slept. The thought nagged at him, refusing to let go. How had he become so disconnected? How had he let this culture of silence take over? By morning, he had made a decision. He would go undercover. No board meetings. No suits. No nameplates. Just a mop, a uniform, and a new identity, Jack Miller, janitor. And whatever he was about to uncover, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The uniform felt strange on Edward's body, cheap fabric, rough against his skin. The name tag read Jack Miller, and for the first time in decades, no one would see him as a CEO. No one would step aside when he walked past. No one would nod respectfully or wait for his approval. He was invisible. The moment he stepped into the building, a security guard barely glanced at him before waving him through. No formal greetings, no eye contact. Just another faceless worker. The janitorial supervisor, a tired-looking man named Reggie, handed him a mop and bucket. "You're the new guy. Stay out of the way, don't ask questions, and don't mess up. Got it?" Edward nodded, gripping the mop tighter than necessary. His first task was to clean the executive offices, the same offices he had spent years ruling from. Now, he was wiping the dust off desks, scrubbing floors, and taking out trash bags full of crumpled reports and half-eaten lunches. It didn't take long for the first shock to hit him. As he emptied a bin in one of the conference rooms, he overheard a hushed conversation. Two mid-level managers stood near the window, voices low but sharp. "They cut our bonuses again," one of them muttered bitterly. "Flint says it's temporary. Meanwhile, the execs are still getting their checks. You think Crawford even knows?" Edward's grip on the trash bag tightened. His bonuses were being paid. He knew that for a fact. But if his employees weren't getting theirs, where was the money going? He moved on to another floor, sweeping near the cubicles. Here, the atmosphere was even heavier. People spoke in whispers, eyes darting toward the supervisor's office as if afraid of being overheard. A young woman named Lillian sat at her desk, rubbing her temples as she stared at a spreadsheet. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to the coworker next to her. "They doubled my workload after Ben got fired. If I say anything, they'll get rid of me too." Her coworker sighed. "Just keep your head down. We don't have a choice." Edward clenched his jaw. His company was supposed to reward hard work, not punish it. What the hell was happening? Hours later, as he took a break in the supply closet, an older janitor named Clarence approached him. The man had a slow, careful way of moving, as if he had seen too much over the years and learned to keep his head down. "You're new, huh?" Clarence said, leaning against the wall. "Yeah," Edward answered, still adjusting to his fake identity. Clarence nodded. "Let me give you some advice, Jack. Keep quiet. They don't care about us. They don't see us. Just do your job, take your check, and go home." Edward frowned. "Who's they?" Clarence chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Management. Executives. The people upstairs." He eyed Edward carefully. "You think they give a damn about the janitors? About the assistants, the customer service reps, the night shift workers?" He shook his head. "They don't even know we exist." Edward swallowed hard. Clarence was wrong. Edward did care. He did see them. And now, more than anything, he needed to know just how deep this problem went. Edward had spent years making decisions from the top, believing he had built a company that valued its people. But now, as he pushed a mop across the marble floors of his own office building, he saw the truth, the cracks in the foundation, the unseen struggle of those who kept the company running while being ignored, overworked, and underpaid. It was late at night when he overheard his next clue. He was in the employee lounge, wiping down tables, when two junior accountants walked in, their voices hushed but urgent. "I don't get it," one of them muttered. "The reports don't add up. We should have enough in the budget for salaries and bonuses, but every time I bring it up to management, they tell me to stop asking questions." The other accountant let out a bitter laugh. "Because they're covering something up. You think those budget cuts are real? The money isn't disappearing, it's being redirected. Probably straight into the executive accounts." Edward kept his head down, but his mind was racing. He had reviewed the financial reports himself, nothing seemed out of place. But if someone was manipulating the data before it reached him, he needed more proof. Later that night, as he took out the trash, he saw Lillian, the young woman he had overheard earlier, still at her desk. Her face was pale, exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders. "You're still here?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. She looked up, startled. "Oh, yeah. My manager just dropped another report on my desk. Said it needs to be done by morning." She forced a weak smile. "Guess sleep is optional." Edward frowned. "That doesn't sound fair." Lillian let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's not. But if I complain, they'll just replace me with someone who won't." She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You don't get it, do you? People like me, we don't matter here. We're just numbers on a spreadsheet, expenses they can cut if we become inconvenient." The words hit Edward harder than he expected. "You matter," he said firmly. Lillian looked at him, surprised, as if she hadn't heard those words in a long time. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the silence. "Hey! You're not being paid to chat." Edward turned to see a floor supervisor, arms crossed, looking at him with irritation. "Get back to work," the man snapped. "Or I'll tell Reggie we've got a slacker on shift." Edward bit back his anger. He wasn't CEO Edward Crawford right now. He was just Jack Miller, the janitor. "Sorry, he muttered and grabbed his mop. But as he walked away, he made himself a promise. No one in his company would ever feel invisible again. It was time to find out who was pulling the strings behind this corruption. Edward had spent his career trusting numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Balance sheets, profit margins, and financial projections had always been the foundation of his decisions. But now, standing in the dimly lit janitorial closet, gripping the handle of his mop like a lifeline, he realized something: numbers could be manipulated. People could lie. And someone in his company was doing exactly that. He had spent the past few nights listening, watching, piecing together fragments of conversations. Employees afraid to speak up. Bonuses disappearing. Budgets that made no sense. There was a common denominator in all of it. Douglas Flint. Edward had known Douglas for years. He had trusted him as his right-hand man, his COO, the one person he believed could run the company in his absence. But now, the evidence was piling up. Douglas wasn't just mismanaging funds, he was stealing. And worse, he was running the company through fear and intimidation. That night, Edward made a plan. If Douglas had built his power through silence and control, then Edward would dismantle it piece by piece. The next day, Edward focused on the smallest details. He studied who was afraid to speak and who was benefiting from the corruption. He noticed how managers avoided certain conversations when a supervisor walked by. How employees flinched when Douglas's name was mentioned. How fear had seeped into every corner of his company. While cleaning outside one of the conference rooms, he overheard a conversation that confirmed his worst suspicions. Two senior managers, voices low but sharp. "He wants the numbers changed again," one of them said. "This is the third time. If we keep shifting these expenses, we'll have to start cutting actual salaries." "You think Flint cares?" "He's protecting himself. He knows if the CEO finds out what's happening, he's done." Edward's pulse quickened. Flint knew. He knew Edward would never approve of this. That meant one thing. Flint was making sure Edward never found out. And he was using his power to crush anyone who got in his way. That evening, Edward found Clarence, the veteran janitor who had warned him to keep his head down. "I need your help," Edward said quietly, setting down his mop. Clarence gave him a long look. "Help with what?" "I need to know everything about Douglas Flint." Clarence exhaled sharply and shook his head. "That man. He's dangerous. You think I don't know what he's been doing? I know plenty. I've seen people fired for no reason, promotions stolen, good workers pushed out so his friends could take their jobs." Edward's fists clenched. "Then why hasn't anyone stopped him?" Clarence laughed bitterly. "Because no one can. He's got the board in his pocket, the department heads terrified, and anyone who steps out of line suddenly finds themselves without a paycheck. You think a janitor like me can fight that?" Edward took a deep breath. "Maybe not a janitor. But what if I told you I wasn't really a janitor?" Clarence narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying, kid?" Edward hesitated. He had kept his identity hidden for this long, but if he wanted Clarence's trust, he had to tell him the truth. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "My name isn't Jack Miller. I'm Edward Crawford." Clarence's eyes widened. He took a step back, studying Edward's face, his expression unreadable. "You're lying." Edward shook his head. "I wish I was." For the first time in his life, Edward saw something in Clarence's expression he had never expected. Hope. "You're really him?" Clarence whispered. "Yeah. And I need your help to take Douglas Flint down." Clarence let out a slow breath, then nodded. "Then let's get to work." Edward had always been a man of action. When he saw a problem, he fixed it. But this was different. Douglas Flint had built a fortress of lies, and if Edward wanted to bring him down, he needed undeniable proof. With Clarence on his side, he had a way to gather information from within. Now, he needed a strategy. Late at night, Edward and Clarence met in the janitor's closet, the only place in the building where no one cared to look. "You need something solid," Clarence said, arms crossed. "If you go after him without real proof, he'll bury you. He's got friends on the board. If they think you're acting on a hunch, they'll side with him." Edward exhaled slowly. He knew Clarence was right. "What about financial records?" Edward asked. "If Flint is moving money around, there has to be a paper trail." Clarence nodded. "Yeah, but you can't get those from down here. That's locked up in corporate servers, and you don't have access." Edward thought for a moment. "Maybe I don't. But someone does." The next day, Edward kept an eye on Lillian, the exhausted analyst he had spoken to before. She was sharp, overworked, and clearly frustrated with how things were being handled. If anyone had seen irregularities in the numbers, it was her. That night, as she packed up her things, Edward approached her. "Long day?" he asked. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "They just keep piling it on. I swear, something's wrong with these reports, but no one will listen. They just want me to shut up and process them." Edward hesitated. If he pushed too hard, she might get scared. But if he didn't push at all, he'd lose his chance. "What if you weren't imagining it?" he said carefully. "What if there really was something wrong with the reports?" Lillian frowned. "What do you mean?" Edward lowered his voice. "I think someone is stealing from the company. And I think they're using you to cover it up." She stared at him, confusion flashing across her face. "You're just a janitor. How would you know that?" Edward held her gaze. He couldn't tell her the full truth, not yet. "Let's just say I've been paying attention." Lillian hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know, even if something shady is going on, there's no way I can prove it. Everything's locked behind corporate security." Edward's heart sank, until she added, almost as an afterthought. "Except the backup servers. They run autosyncs every night. If someone forgot to wipe an old version of the budget reports, the numbers might not match up." Edward felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the crack in Flint's armor. "You can access those?" he asked. Lillian chewed her lip. "I mean, yeah, but if anyone finds out." "They won't," Edward promised. For a long moment, Lillian stared at him, weighing her options. Then, finally, she exhaled and nodded. "Okay. Meet me here tomorrow night." The next day dragged on painfully slow. Edward mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and pretended to be just another invisible worker. But inside, his mind was racing. If Lillian found what he suspected, everything would change. Finally, night fell. He met her in an empty office, where she had a laptop open, fingers flying over the keyboard. "I found something," she whispered. Edward leaned in. On the screen were two spreadsheets, one from the official records and one from the backup server. The numbers didn't match. Lillian's eyes were wide. "They've been shifting funds. The budget was altered before it went to the board. These are the original numbers." Edward scanned the figures. The missing bonuses, the unexplained cuts, all of it had been rerouted to a private executive fund. And at the bottom of the report was a signature. Douglas Flint. Edward clenched his fists. This was it. Proof. But before he could say anything, Lillian gasped. Edward turned just in time to see the office door swing open. Douglas Flint was standing in the doorway. And he did not look happy. Douglas Flint stepped into the room, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the scene. Lillian froze, her hands still on the keyboard, the damning spreadsheets glowing on the screen. Edward could feel the tension in the air shift, Flint knew. For a moment, no one moved. Then Douglas let out a slow, amused chuckle. Well, well. What do we have here? His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. An overworked analyst snooping through files she shouldn't be touching, and a janitor who seems far too interested in things that don't concern him. Edward stayed still, keeping his face neutral. He couldn't let Flint see that he was afraid. Lillian swallowed hard, trying to shut the laptop. I was just. Flint held up a hand. Save it. He took a step closer, and Edward instinctively shifted, positioning himself between Flint and Lillian. Douglas noticed. His eyes narrowed. Edward could see the gears turning in his mind. Flint was smart, too smart. He had built his power on knowing who to silence and when. He had survived this long by eliminating threats before they could become problems. And right now, he saw Edward and Lillian as a problem. You have no idea what you're doing, Flint said, his voice quiet, measured. That file? It means nothing. A clerical error at best. You think you're onto something big? You're not. And if you try to make something out of this, you'll regret it. Lillian's breathing was shaky, but Edward could feel her anger rising. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm, steadying her. Then, for the first time, he spoke. I think you're scared, Flint. Flint's expression flickered, just for a second. Then he smirked. Scared? Of you? He scoffed. You don't even know what you're up against. Edward took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. No, I do. I know exactly what you've been doing. I know about the missing money. I know about the falsified reports. And I know that if the board finds out, you won't just lose your job, you'll go to prison. Flint's smirk faltered. That's a bold claim for a janitor. Edward met his gaze, unflinching. Then let me reintroduce myself. He straightened his posture, the air around him shifting, the authority in his voice undeniable. I'm Edward Crawford. The color drained from Flint's face. Silence. Then, he laughed, a short, breathless sound, full of disbelief and anger. No. That's not possible. He looked Edward up and down, as if trying to piece together the reality of the man standing in front of him. You're lying. Edward didn't blink. Am I? Flint's fingers curled into fists. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. All right, he muttered. You're Crawford. Fine. Then let's talk. He took a step back, gesturing toward the door. Come with me, we'll handle this privately. No need to involve anyone else. Lillian tensed. Edward didn't move. Flint wanted to isolate him. To regain control. To silence him. Edward had spent years negotiating with powerful men. He knew this game, and he knew exactly how Flint played it. Let me make something clear, Edward said, his voice calm but firm. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't call the shots anymore. I do. He turned to Lillian. Send the files to every board member. Now. Lillian's hands flew across the keyboard. Flint lunged forward, but Edward stepped in his path, standing tall. Try it, Edward said, his voice ice-cold. Flint stopped. He knew the moment those files went out, his time was up. Lillian hit send. Flint exhaled sharply, his face twisting in anger. You just made a big mistake, he hissed. Edward tilted his head. No. You did. And then security arrived. 2 guards stepped into the room, their expressions unreadable. Edward had arranged it beforehand, the moment the files were sent, security would be notified. One of the guards turned to Edward. Mr. Crawford. What do you want us to do? Edward met Flint's furious gaze. Escort Mr. Flint off the premises. He's fired. Effective immediately. Flint's breath hitched. For the first time, he looked afraid. You can't do this, he whispered. Edward took a step closer. Yes, I can. The guards grabbed Flint by the arms, dragging him toward the door. He thrashed, his composure cracking completely. This isn't over, Crawford, he shouted. You think you won? You're making a mistake. The board won't side with you. Edward watched him struggle, watched the man who had ruled with fear finally face the consequences of his actions. And then, just before Flint was pulled from the room, Edward delivered his final words. You're done. The door slammed shut. For the first time in weeks, the weight on Edward's shoulders felt lighter. Lillian let out a shaky breath. Is it really over? Edward exhaled. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he knew, his company could be saved. The echoes of Douglas Flint's final outburst still lingered in the air long after security had dragged him away. The moment should have felt like victory, but Edward knew better. The battle wasn't over. Flint had spent years embedding himself in the company, weaving a web of corruption that stretched deep into upper management. Just removing him wouldn't be enough, Edward had to rebuild everything from the ground up. He turned to Lillian, who was still gripping the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. Are you okay? She nodded, exhaling shakily. I didn't think that would actually work. Edward gave her a small, reassuring smile. It worked because you had the courage to do the right thing. For the first time since they met, Lillian straightened her back, a hint of pride in her expression. She had been afraid before, but now, she knew she had power. And she wasn't the only one. The next morning, Edward walked into the building, not as Jack Miller, the janitor, but as Edward Crawford, the CEO. The moment he stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, heads turned. Some employees stared in shock, whispering to one another. Others, the ones who had aligned themselves with Flint, paled, realizing their days might be numbered. Edward didn't stop. He marched straight into the boardroom, where a crisis meeting was already underway. The board members sat around the long mahogany table, tense and silent. Most of them had already seen the financial reports Lillian had sent the night before. Edward, one of them said cautiously as he took his seat at the head of the table. We heard about Flint's departure. That was a bold move. Edward met their gazes, unshaken. It wasn't bold. It was necessary. An older board member, Robert Ellsworth, leaned forward. And what do you plan to do now? Edward folded his hands on the table. Fix this company. Silence. Then, another board member scoffed. Fix it? Do you realize what you've done? Douglas had connections. He handled everything, investors, accounts, operations. Without him, we could be in serious trouble. Edward held back a bitter laugh. Handled everything? You mean he was stealing from the company while keeping you all too comfortable to notice? A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Ellsworth cleared his throat. What exactly is your plan, Edward? Edward leaned forward. Step 1, full transparency. We're bringing in external auditors to review every financial decision Flint made in the past 5 years. Murmurs spread around the room. Some of the board members didn't like that idea. Step 2, rebuilding trust. Effective immediately, salaries for lower-level employees will be re-evaluated, and those who have been overworked and underpaid will get what they deserve. More whispers. And step 3, Edward said, his voice turning ice-cold, anyone who was involved in Flint's corruption will be held accountable. If I find out that anyone in this room helped him cover up his crimes, I will personally make sure you answer for it. Silence. Then, slowly, Ellsworth nodded. It's about time, he said simply. The tension in the room shifted. Some board members were still uneasy, but others, the ones who hadn't liked Flint's methods, looked relieved. For the first time in years, real change was coming. Over the next few weeks, Edward followed through on his promises. The auditors uncovered millions in misallocated funds, proving just how deep Flint's corruption ran. Several managers were fired or arrested, and new leadership was put in place, people who actually cared about the employees, not just profit margins. Clarence, the veteran janitor who had been ignored for decades, was promoted to oversee building operations. His first request: better wages and working conditions for janitorial staff. Edward didn't hesitate to approve it. Lillian, the young analyst who had risked everything, was moved to a leadership role in the financial department. She had been underestimated for too long, but not anymore. One by one, the people who had been treated as invisible were finally seen. And slowly, Crawford Industries began to heal. One evening, as Edward was leaving the office, he passed by a new janitor, a young man pushing a mop, looking exhausted. Edward stopped. "Thank you for your hard work," he said sincerely. The janitor blinked in surprise. Yeah. Sure. Thanks." As Edward walked toward the elevator, he smiled to himself. He had gone undercover expecting to fix his company. Instead, he had rediscovered its soul. The morning air was crisp as Edward Crawford stepped into his office. Not as an untouchable CEO, isolated in a glass tower, but as a leader who had finally seen his company for what it truly was. For the first time in years, he felt connected. The corruption had been uprooted, but that didn't mean the wounds were healed. Employees were still cautious, still waiting to see if this change was real. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a day. Edward knew that. And he was willing to earn it. Over the next few weeks, changes became visible across Crawford Industries. For the first time in years, the company wasn't just profitable, it was fair. Overworked employees got relief. Departments were restructured so that no one was forced to carry double the workload. Salaries were adjusted. Those who had been unfairly underpaid saw real raises, not just empty promises. Bonuses were restored. The money that had been funneled into hidden accounts under Douglas Flint's orders was returned to the employees who had earned it. Management was reshaped. The days of fear and intimidation were over. Those who had ruled through bullying and threats were replaced by people who valued integrity. Edward made sure that every single decision was public and transparent. He walked the floors daily, checking in with employees, listening to their concerns, making sure that no one was ever afraid to speak up again. And the results were undeniable. For the first time in years, people smiled when they came to work. They felt safe. They felt valued. Crawford Industries was alive again. One evening, Edward took the elevator down to the lower floors, the same ones he had cleaned as Jack Miller, the janitor. He stepped into the janitorial lounge, where Clarence sat at a table, sipping his usual black coffee. The moment he saw Edward, he smirked. "You lost, boss." Edward chuckled. "Maybe a little." He sat across from him, looking around the room. "This place feels different now." Clarence took a sip of coffee. "Yeah. People ain't walking around scared anymore." "That's new." Edward nodded. "That's how it should have been all along." Clarence leaned back, watching him carefully. "You actually did it, huh?" Edward exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Not alone. I had help." Clarence smirked. "Damn right you did." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Clarence spoke again, his tone softer. "You know, kid. You ain't the same man who walked in here pretending to be a janitor." Edward glanced down at the table, then back at Clarence. "You're right," he admitted. "I'm not." The experience had changed him. He had seen what real struggle looked like. He had seen what happened when leadership forgot the people who actually kept the company running. And he would never forget again. As Edward left the building that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not power. Not control. Pride. Not because the company was making money. Not because he had won some corporate battle. But because he had done the right thing. He had saved more than just his business. He had saved the people who made it what it was. And for the first time in years, Crawford Industries wasn't just a company. It was a family. At its core, this story isn't just about a CEO going undercover, it's about rediscovering humanity in leadership. Edward Crawford started as a man obsessed with numbers, success, and control. He thought his company was thriving because the report said so. But true success isn't just about profits or efficiency, it's about people. And the moment he stepped out of his ivory tower, he saw the reality he had ignored for years. Fear. Injustice. Corruption. But he also saw something else, resilience. The janitors who kept going, even when no one noticed them. The employees who worked tirelessly, even when they weren't fairly compensated. The people who still believed in the company, even when it didn't believe in them. Edward's journey wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about transformation. Not just of the company, but of himself. He became the leader he should have been all along. A leader who listens. A leader who values people. A leader who doesn't rule with fear, but with integrity. This story reminds us that leadership isn't about sitting at the top and giving orders. It's about being willing to walk through the trenches, to understand the struggles of those beneath you, and to fight for them, not just for profits. Edward Crawford saved his company, not by enforcing power, but by earning trust. And in the end, that's the kind of leadership that truly lasts.